before listening to this sermon, if you could please read Genesis chapter 11 and Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 to 3. There should be a link below this video. I'm going to begin by asking a very controversial question. Sprouts on Christmas Day, do they make or ruin Christmas? Or another question, Jeremy Clarkson, love him or can't stand him? Or how about Jaffa cakes, a cake or a biscuit? Marmite, the correct way to hang toilet paper, Brexit. These are all issues in which you're either on one side or the other. You cannot be both. And for this reason, these issues divide the world. Now answer these questions in your head. And these questions all relate to the significant division that is described throughout Genesis, but is particularly highlighted in chapters 10 to 12. What is your source of authority when it comes to right and wrong? Is it God or is it yourself? The next time you sin, how do you predict yourself responding? Returning to God in confession with a willingness to change, or continuing on regardless? Where would you describe as your true home? To put it in practical terms, where are you investing your bricks and mortar of resources and time? Are you investing mostly in the life you're making for yourself in the here and now? Or are your sights fixed on your eternal home in ways that are reflected in your priorities? These are all issues that the world divides over. You are either one or the other. So with this in mind, what is your direction in life? Are you heading towards God or away? Remember, you are either one or the other. You cannot be both. Are you heading eastward or westward? Genesis 11 verses 1 to 2. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. To you and me, this sounds like nothing more than a geographical reference. The people moved east. But when the writer of Genesis stresses the word east, he is making a very specific point. In the first few chapters of Genesis, east is always the direction of those moving further and further away from God. Adam and Eve were sent east, away from God and the Garden of Eden. After Cain sinned, he headed eastward, east of Eden yet again. When Abraham and Lot split, Lot headed east, towards the sinful cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. In these first few chapters, east is always the direction of those moving further away from God. And in the opening verses of chapter 11, we hear of people heading east yet again. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone, and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city." Since we're all people who live in a northeast city or town, I hope we all agree there's nothing wrong with heading east or building permanent places to live. But in this case, it was what was going on below the surface that mattered. The people's attitude and motivations. To help see this, trace your finger back in your Bible to chapter 10. Chapter 10 verses 8 to 10 we read, Nimrod became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Either under Nimrod's leadership or through his influence, the people moved eastward to form the kingdom of Babel. Who was this Nimrod? Well, 3 times we hear that Nimrod was mighty. Twice we hear that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The word before means in the face of, a word that in the context means against. For example, today Newcastle face Tottenham Hotspur in the Premier League. Last week the boxer Tyson Fury stood before Wilder in the ring. In both these examples, one person or team is fighting against the other. They are using all of their might against the opposition. In much the same way, we're given the impression that Nimrod was using all of his might in opposition to the Lord. He was doing everything in his power to rebel. And the world at that time decided to join him. Like Nimrod, they wanted to rebel against God with all their might. For this reason, they headed eastward in their desire for independence. After finding a place they could call their own, they used bricks and mortar to build themselves a permanent home. It was as if they wanted their desire to be free of God's influence set in stone. God's influence in my life? No thanks. Contrast this to what we read of in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. The Lord said to Abraham, who would later be called Abraham, the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." Chapters 11 and 12 are placed together because God wants us to see the contrast that exists. Everyone in the world is either heading eastward or westward in a spiritual sense. Nimrod and crew headed eastward, seeking to be independent of God's influence. In contrast, Abraham headed westward, seeking to know God for himself. Nimrod and crew wanted to establish their own way of living, apart from God. Abraham listened to God and obeyed. Nimrod and crew were convinced that they knew the quickest route to joy and satisfaction. Abraham believed that what God offered him was better. Everyone in the world is either on the same journey as Nimrod or Abraham, heading westward or heading eastward, seeking God or running away, believing that God knows the route to joy, or convinced that we know the way ourselves. You and I are either heading eastward or westward. We cannot be both. Now the big question is, which are you? This is the point in the sermon where we could quickly answer this question in our heads and all too quickly move on. You might have said to yourself, "Of course I'm heading westward. I'm a Christian." Or, for whatever reason, you might have said, "Not interested, thanks. I'm heading the way I'm heading. I'm not interested in any alternative." Whichever you are, I'd like you to join me in giving this issue, this important issue, a little more thought. First off, you may want to continue as you are because the idea of submitting to God sounds, well, anything but appealing. If you think this way, well, thank you for your honesty. Submitting to the will of anybody else certainly sounds at first oppressive, certainly not a route to joy. But think about this. If I was to give you 50 quid to buy a ticket to see any music artist of your choice, would you choose somebody who was better than you at playing the piano, or the same? Pretty much in every area of life, we seek out people who are better than us at something. We seek out musicians who can play better than us. We seek out doctors who know more than our basic knowledge. We seek out experts who can make sense of mortgage applications and pensions. We want our football team to sign players who can play football better than us, preferably the likes of Ronaldo, the best in the world. In every area of life, we seek out people who are better than us at something. So why, when it comes to the wisest and best way to live, do we seek to live independent of God? Why do we ignore the wisdom of the God who created the universe? Why are we always so sure that we know the fastest and quickest way to joy? Why do we look down on God, thinking that we know better, even though in every other area of life we seek out people who know more? Like the people of Babel, who limited themselves to their own wisdom and chose to live as they thought best, you could be at risk of making the same mistake. Maybe that's the thought you should go away with this morning. But what about if you count yourself a Christian? What about if you share the faith of Abraham, who began that westward journey? Is it as simple as set off on this journey and never look back? I'm going to read some words from Acts chapter 7. Stephen said to the Jews, "Brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, and said to him, 'Go out from your land and from your kindred, and go to the land that I will show you.'" God told Abraham to head westward, and Abraham obeyed, believing God's promise that the place he would show him was better. Verse 4. Then he went out from the land of the Chaldeans. That is, Abraham journeyed past the land of the Chaldeans. That means he passed the people of Babel. Then Abraham went out from the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. Abraham began his journey westward, journeying to the promised land, but then stopped. Something caused Abraham's faith to dry up and his obedience to decrease. The Bible isn't specific about what this was. It simply highlights that he passed through the land of the Chaldeans, the people of Babel. And, using an illustration, I want you to think about what kind of influence this might have had on him. Picture a path to a place with a sign saying, "Keep off the grass." And one day someone decides they're going to do as they please. They're going to walk across the path and cut the corner. Keeping to the path is bad, they say. It'll only slow me down. Walking across the grass is good. I'll get to my destination quicker. And so naturally, that is what they do. The next day, somebody else sees these footsteps in the grass. And what do? They follow those footsteps, cutting the corner. And why? Well, after seeing the first person's footsteps, they felt like this was the permission for them to do the same. And the next day, the same thing happens again and again and again. And eventually, so many people are ignoring the sign and cutting across the grass that within the grass Muddy footprints can be seen going across, and an entire new pathway has been formed. Now you pass by. Now you have to decide what route to take. What kind of influence is that muddied path going to have on your thoughts? Well, that path, it looks appealing. Everyone else agrees that it's the best. And I know in my head that my head is pulling me in one direction. After all, the sign says keep off the grass. But my heart is being pulled in another direction instead. If you are a person of faith like Abraham, you will no doubt find yourself pulled in both directions by the world around you. For just as the sign saying keep off the grass eventually got taken down, so too in our world the sign saying that God is God has got taken down. Everyone is carving their own path in life, and the more people who do this, the more we follow. This fact is perfectly illustrated in the following two songs by Oasis, a great band, maybe not so great lyrics. I'm free to be whatever I choose, and I'll sing the blues if I want. I'm free to say whatever I like. If it's wrong or right, it's all right. And the other songs, you gotta roll with it. You gotta take your time. You gotta say what you say. Don't let anybody get in your way. Don't ever stand aside. Don't ever be denied. You want to be who you'd be if you're coming with me. You've got to carve your own path. Decide yourself what's right. Choose the God of me and be free. Don't let anyone disagree, including God. If the Bible is right, then something about this way of thinking appeals to our human nature. We want to be boss of our own lives. Simply watch your reaction next time somebody tells you what you should be doing. And since this wanting to be our own boss outlook is the song of our culture, we're all influenced by this way of thinking. I certainly know that I am. I may have set off westward, seeking God, full of faith and willing to obey. I may have set off westward, but I find myself turning away from God, convinced that the world around me has discovered a better and quicker route to satisfaction and joy. Maybe you can relate to that too. If you do, where do you go from here? Is there hope for those of us who find that their faith is often lacking and their obedience is often imperfect? Well, lastly, we're going to look at the God who comes down. Acts chapter 7 verse 4. Abraham went out from the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. And after his father died, God removed him. That's the language of powerful intervention. God removed him from there into this land in which you are now living. We hear that God came downward in power in such a way that Abraham set off westward again. In other words, God was the decisive factor in Abraham's change. But God's coming downward to intervene in Abraham's life wasn't just a one-off occasion. God wants to change your and my life too. For if you read the stories of Babel and Abraham together, you'll learn that God's desire is to intervene and bless the world. Let's begin with God's intervention in chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people, speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. The Lord came down, saw the world turning away from him, and intervened. And why? Well, the reason given is that God saw that nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them, i.e., there is no limit to what they might do. This does not mean God saw that they'd soon be able to do the impossible, advance to the point where they could fly and do miracles and fire lasers out of their eyeballs. Instead, it seems to me that this is a statement not about miracles, but about morals. For when people declare themselves to be their own God, morals go out of the window. The murder of unborn children, the use of power to abuse others, especially the vulnerable, the use of a privileged position to fuel a person's own greed, the use of torture to deliberately cause other human beings to suffer, the use of paid sex to feed a person's own lust, the use of tact and skill to hook people on drugs, flood countries with drugs, and destroy thousands of lives, except your own. Chuck God out of the window, and there is no moral boundary that man is unwilling to cross. There is no act too perverse that man will not commit. I don't say this as somebody who piously looks out on the world in condemnation. I say this as somebody who agrees with Stephen King. Stephen King in The Shining writes, "Monsters are real. They live inside of us, and sometimes they win." Give the monster inside of me free rein to do what it wants, and verse 6 would be true for me. Nothing they plan to do will be impossible, i.e., there is no limit to what I might do. And so rather than letting man climb upward and claim the title of God for himself, God came downward and intervened. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people, speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Rather than letting mankind continue in its unrestrained rebellion, God came downward and intervened. For by turning a world of one language into a world of several languages, people would be less able to coordinate each other or encourage each other down this ungodly path. An act of judgment? Well, yes, sort of. But chapter 12 reveals that it is more an act of God's grace. Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 to 3. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Right at the moment when people were zealously turning away from God, God begins his plan to turn people back. For verses 1 to 3 reveal God's plan not to judge the world, but to save it. For one of Abraham's descendants, one of his offspring, a great-great-great-grandson of Abraham, would be the person of Jesus, someone through whom all peoples on earth will and can be blessed. I make no apologies for ending this sermon on the much repeated theme of Jesus. We need him no matter how advanced as a Christian we are. I even rewrote this sermon, something that I never ever do, simply because the first sermon I wrote was all about us, and us. You and I must try harder. You and I must make sure we stay on the right path. You and I must have more faith and obey God more. Yes, we all need to do these things. But if we were left to ourselves, we'd all be like the people of Babel, who turned away from God and never looked back. But by reminding ourselves that God is a God whose nature is to come down, coming down to put a stop to our rebellion, and powerfully pointing us in the right direction. If we remind ourselves that God is a God whose nature is to come down, then we all have access to Him next time we find ourselves going astray. God came down and intervened to help Abraham back on his journey. God came down in Jesus so that you and I can begin this same journey. God came down in the Spirit to give us the power to keep going on this journey of faith. Simple application. God came down. God's willing to come down. Make the most of that offer.